Alright, I'm so glad you could join us again. This is Heath Close with Build Box, and I'd like to welcome you to part 2 of the Make Your Own Game series. In part 1, we got a lot of work done on our game Glitch. We used the creator to build a playable skeleton of a wall jump game. We dropped in a ton of graphics to customize it, including our menus. And at the end of part 1, I said we would get into level design in part 2. And although we are not going to actually build levels until part 3, everything we discuss here in part 2 is the foundation of level design. So it begins now. In part 2, we're going to discuss editing the collision shapes for those graphics we dropped into Glitch in part 1. We are going to bring in a new enemy into our game and bring it to life by going into great detail on the object settings and the object components, all of which will lay the foundation we need to actually begin building our levels in part 3. So another huge video for you, packed with information. Let's get to it. The first thing we need to talk about is collision shapes. Collision shapes are what BuildBox uses to decide when objects interact. For example, my character looks like it hits the wall and is stopped because the collision shape of my character has collided with the collision shape of the wall. And so without collision shapes, the graphic for my character would just fly off the screen, and it would be no fun. So let's start with the character. In the Assets panel to the far left, select the character, and you will see the global options appear in the Options panel to the far right. Directly above the default animation, remember we replaced that default animation with sequential PNG images in part 1. So directly above the default animation of any object in BuildBox, character or otherwise, is the button for editing the collision shape. Let's go ahead and click on that and open the collision shape editor. The first thing we want to do is get our object nice and big in the editor so we can get as precise as we can. You can resize this window, so get it nice and big on your screen. Just like in any other editor in BuildBox, the mouse scroll button will zoom us in and out, and holding down the space bar while we click and drag will move the editor around. So let's get that nice and big and in the center. You'll notice almost immediately our collision shape is off. This orange shape here represents what BuildBox will use to determine if it hits something. What we want is the collision shape to match the graphic. Now, clearly we have the right shape already because our character is circular and we replaced a circular graphic. So the super easy fix is to just drag it so it's centered. You would just grab it in the middle and put it where you need it. But what if in video 1 we had dropped in a square graphic for our character? Let me just show you some of the options in this collision shape editor. In the upper left is where we can choose between a polygon shape and the circular shape we have now. We can move the points around to get a more precise fit. We can add points. We can subtract points. And we can reset the image if we've got it all messed up. So let's go back to the circular shape and use the middle handle to move it around and the outside handle to resize it. Now, whenever I create collision shapes, I want to make sure they are just a bit forgiving. This way, we don't run the risk of the user feeling cheated when they get killed, deciding the game is unfair, and also, when you give the user leeway with collision shapes, they experience excitement when they have close calls. When they have that moment that they think, I can't believe I just lived through that, they experience a lift in their excitement level, making your game more fun and putting the achievement on the player. It transfers greatness onto them. So leave a little leeway when designing your collision shapes, and you will increase your fun factor for your game. All right, let's close the collision shape editor for our character and go over to the Assets panel and select the walls. bring up their global options to the far right in the options panel, and edit the collision shape. Now you can see that this one is dead on, but if we had come in here and it was off, the square graphics are usually dead on after a reset. So just use the reset button as a starting point and you'll likely be done anyway. Alright, close the editor, and now let's do the enemy graphic we dropped in for the triangle enemies. Select the enemy in the Assets panel to the far left. The global options appear in the far right in the Options panel, where we can click on Edit Collision Shape. Okay, let's get our graphic nice and big and centered. Remember, you can resize this window, taking up the whole screen if you need to. Now, you might be starting to understand you can see the collision shape the creator cooked up for us from our original triangle enemy. You can see our triangle as it used to be before we replaced the graphic. So this is already a great starting point for us. Let's start at the top and leave a little leeway so people don't feel cheated and they get that excitement of a close call. Remember the mouse scroll button to zoom in and out, and hold the space bar while clicking and dragging to move it around. Let's drag this lower left one onto the corner. And now let's add a point. BuildBox is now telling us that collision shapes must be convex, meaning any angles inside the collision shape must not exceed 180 degrees. And as you can see, this inside angle has indeed exceeded a straight line. So because the character is never going to fit inside this area here without touching one of these tips, we're okay just allowing the collision shape to share the tips here. Although we are not being precise with our collision shape, that doesn't mean we can't make a composite object with more precise collision shapes. But for the sake of time and keeping the instructions simple, I will show you how to do that in the Tips, Tricks, and Hacks video later in this series. But this is going to work just fine for what we're doing. Now let's select our top point and add another point. The Add button always adds a point clockwise from the one you have selected. Let's move these last two into position. In this area right here, I wouldn't want a player to hit this and think there was nothing there to hit and ask, why did I just die, and rage quit our game? So let's just make sure there is plenty of leeway for this tip here. I will show you why this works based on how we are going to face this graphic anyway. Also, keep in mind we can get precise, but I will show you that later in that Tips, Tricks, and Hacks video. But for the sake of time and instruction, let's just give this last point here plenty of leeway. Alright, this looks good. So now let's open one final object we have in the Assets panel, our one-way platform. Let's just drop in the same graphic we did for the walls so it looks the same, but we can make it so that we can move through this object but not go back through the other way. Let's get into the collision shape of this object so I can explain a little further. Remember, hit the reset, and on most square graphics, you are likely done. Notice the big green arrow on our collision shape. This denotes pass-through, and this can be turned on and off up here in the left corner next to the Shape menu, and it can be moved in any direction. So what this does is allow the character to pass through the collision shape of the object in the direction the arrow is pointing. So if we want to pass through an object for some reason, make sure the arrow is pointing in the direction you want the character to be able to pass through, and the collision shape will be ignored by the character. In any other direction, it will hit, but in the direction of this arrow, it will be ignored and allowed to pass through. We could get really creative with this and come up with some neat game mechanics. So let's just see if this comes into play later, but at least now you're aware we have the option. So now that we have made sure that our collision shapes are where they should be and that they match the graphics, it's time to show you what debug mode is. I had mentioned in part 1 that this button in the upper right was debug mode and that it was a more advanced feature, and it is, But now that you are familiar with collision shapes, this will make a whole lot more sense. So let's turn on debug mode. I'm sure you've already figured out what this does, and you'd be right. What debug mode does is reveal the collision shapes for all the objects in the game. Let's duplicate one of these mountain-looking enemies and make it nice and big for us to see. If I zoom in on this for you using the mouse scroll button and holding space while I click and drag to move the scene around, you can see now that the collision shapes are exactly what we modified them to be. Not only is revealing the collision shapes a creative and helpful element of level design, it is also extremely useful for testing. At some point, and believe me, this will happen, but at some point, you are going to get knee-deep into a game and realize you keep hitting something or falling off something, and you'll keep dying on something that you can't see, and you'll be face planting into your keyboard, wondering what is going on, and debug mode is going to save your sanity, because it is also available in the preview window. So let's play our game, and I'll show you how useful that is. Click on Preview to play our game, and debug mode is up here in the upper left. We can turn it on right now, but in menus that only contain images and no actual objects, there are no collision shapes. Now, later in that tips, tricks, and hacks video I mentioned, I'll show you how to create a live background scene of your game in the main menu. But for now, we only have images in our menu. So let's play it and see what debug mode does for us. So if there was something you had in the middle of the screen that you keep hitting, even if you had a completely invisible object, the collision shape will still show. This is extremely helpful when testing. With debug mode off, you can see that we cannot see what we keep dying on, but we can turn on debug mode in the upper left and, oh yeah, we set a giant invisible mountain in our path. I forgot. Now, as silly as that might seem, it's going to happen. I guarantee it. So debug mode will save your sanity one day. It's a very helpful tool. So that's the lowdown on collision shapes and debug mode. Let's bring in a new enemy so we can discuss object settings in detail. This will make the world and character settings we discuss in Part 3 make much more sense and get you prepared for the actual building of your levels in BuildBox. So remember, BuildBox is drag and drop. And in Part 1, we dropped in a sequence of PNG images for our character's default animation. So to bring in a new enemy, all we're going to do is select its entire default animation sequence and just drag the entire sequence into BuildBox. BuildBox will present us with the drag and drop wheel, and we just drop it on the object option, and BuildBox will create our new enemy object complete with the animation sequence as its default animation. Let's select our new object in the Assets panel to the far left and bring up its global options in the Options panel to the far right, and let's edit its collision shape. Having the option to choose between a polygon shape and a circular shape, I think the circle would work best with this enemy. Let's have a look at our new enemy in our game. He's doing his thing there, being his bad self, rotating around in a death swirl of spikes, but you'll notice if we hit it, it doesn't kill us. So let's make sure he is set up as an enemy that we have to avoid. We do this by changing the object's properties by selecting the object and revealing the options in the Options panel. We already selected our new object in the Assets panel, and that brought up the global options. But now, to get the enemy to behave as we see fit in one of our scenes in the game, we select the enemy in the scene. So select the object we want to modify to bring up the object's properties in the Options panel. The first menu here gives us some presets to use. We'll likely play with these as we design Glitch, but for this object, we want it to be an enemy. So let's select Enemy. Now, we could make this a physics object so that the world settings, which we will get into in part 3, will affect its behavior. But I'm going to leave this fixed so we can go over the movement settings in just a moment. So as I click on the enemy and drag him around, you can see the position settings change. The position is, of course, the position of the object in the scene. The same with the rotation. As I click and drag the rotation handle, you can see it changing in the options panel. Now understand that we can change options to be precise, or you can design by look and feel by clicking and dragging. It's all up to you, but let's go ahead and change that rotation back to be precisely 0. Now you can see it's the same with the scale. As I grab the handles and move it around, the scale changes in the options panel. But notice the flip to negative scale. We are actually going to use this later, so keep that in mind, but for now, let's change it back to 1:1. We can also change the opacity. So maybe we want this object to be see-through but not invisible. We could just make it say 0.2 for 20%, but we're going to change it back and use 1. Now, if we wanted to, we could give this new enemy movement. So as it is now, it is just a fixed object in our scene running its animation, set up as an enemy, and we'll need to avoid it. But we could go even one step further and give it movement. So let's talk about the movement settings, starting with linear velocity. The linear velocity settings are set up with the first row of variables representing the x-axis and the second row of variables representing the y-axis. You can also see 2 columns for these variables, and I'll get to that second column after we discuss this first column here. So to get started on some of these movement settings, let's put a -3 in the x-axis, and we will see our enemy move at that speed in the negative direction on the x-axis. The higher the number, the faster he'll move. There he goes, just a spinning death swirl of spikes out for a stroll as they do. But let's move that -3 to the y-axis and have a look at that movement. You can see he's moving down now. If we make it a +3, he'll move up with our game direction, and we could even use this in a creative way. If we make him fast enough, say 13, he will stay on the screen longer, increasing the difficulty for our player by increasing the amount of time our player needs to avoid him. Now, still on this first column, the angular velocity is a neat setting, and the best way I can explain what it does is it puts an object into orbit. Let me show you what I mean. Let's put 100 in the angular velocity and see how it behaves. See how it looks like it's in orbit around an invisible force? The higher the number we put in there, the tighter the orbit. So if we put in a very low number, like 4, it will have a giant orbit and give a neat arc to its movement. Okay, now for this second column. The first column was simple. Put exact numbers in there, and when we come across our enemy, he will behave under those exact guidelines. The second column, however, are guidelines for randomness. For example, if we reset all the variables in the first column to 0 and put a 10 in the x-axis randomizer in that second column, our enemy will now choose a speed 10 units on either side of 0, so between -10 and +10, and it will be a random number every time the enemy appears. Let's duplicate our enemy and see how 3 different versions choose their random number. I'm just using A to duplicate the object to the left. Remember, you can use W, A, S, or D to duplicate objects in scenes. And I'm holding Shift while I drag to keep them in a nice line. So now let's see how the random velocities look. You can see all 3 are choosing random speeds between -10 and +10 along that x-axis. The column 2 randomizer is also the same for the y-axis row and the angular velocity row. So let's delete our duplicates and change the original by adding 10 in the y-axis randomizer and 15 in the angular velocity randomizer, so we get a nice giant random arc to its orbit between negative 15 and positive 15, and duplicate it using A, holding shift to drag, and let's have a few good looks at their behavior now. Some of the enemies are going up, some of them are going down, some left, some right, and this can create surprise in your game. Now, these numbers work well for our game, but if I put a 50 in the x-axis setting and leave that 10 in the randomizer, that means the character will choose a random number, 10 units on either side of 50, so essentially anywhere between 40 and 60. So there are creative ways to use that randomizer when the time comes. Let's get it back to all zeros in the left column and 10, 10, and 15 in the randomizer column. So that covers movement fairly well. There are two more settings here, one for collision type. Ours is an enemy, so we want to leave it to collide, but we could set it up to have its collision shape ignored if we wanted to, but we will leave it on collide. And then the destroy type. And since it is an enemy, we want at minimum to say destroy character. But we could have this enemy lay waste to anything it touches using destroy all. And that might work in a different game, but we will leave it to destroy the character only in Glitch. Okay, let's talk about object components. There are options you can add to any object in the game. The first is Wakeup. The Wakeup component allows objects to lay dormant unless we get either close to them or touch them. Since these objects are enemies, collision-based Wakeup won't make any sense because we'll just die at the moment of collision. But if this was, say, a platform that we wanted to jump on and have it move after we touched it, then this is the setting that would allow for that game mechanic. But for our enemy, we want distance-based. Distance-based is measured in pixels, so if we wanted this enemy to lay dormant until we were 300 pixels away, we would put 300 in this Wakeup distance setting. So now when we play our game, the enemy lays dormant running its default animation until we reach that 300 pixel threshold. Then it takes off using the random numbers we gave it. I think that 300 pixels is perfect. It's close enough to be a surprise, and with the random numbers fairly low in the movement settings, it's a nice difficulty to start with. So let's say we want our enemy to go back to being dormant after we get, say, 200 pixels away. We just enable this sleep setting here by selecting distance-based and put 200 in the sleep distance. Now when we play our game, the enemy will go back to being dormant while we scoot off to safety. What's interesting is if our enemy takes off away from us when it wakes and gets to that 200 pixel threshold, it will stop dead and now be in our way, making for an additional avoidance mechanic. So it's an elegant way to achieve more than one mechanic using this sleep option, and we can do all sorts of creative things with this Wakeup component. Now let's delete this Wakeup component, and I'll show you the other component you can add to objects in the game, the spawner component. As you can see, we have the same two-column structure to the settings. So exact behavior in that left column, random behavior on the right column. And this is measured in seconds. So if we leave the spawner to its default, let's see what happens. As you can see, it spawns additional copies of itself. And with that 1 in the settings, it will spawn every 1 second. If we set a very low number, say 0.2 seconds, it unleashes an army of swirling death at probably an unfair pace. So let's use this setting wisely. One thing you'll notice now is the original does not show when you add a spawner component. Only the spawned clones will show. If we had our enemy spawning off screen and then coming into play, that wouldn't matter, but I'll let you in on an early tip, trick, and hack right here. We can select the enemy and press Ctrl-C or Command-C to copy it, and then Ctrl-V or Command-V to paste it. You can copy and paste any object into any scene, anywhere, in any world. Now with this copy, We just take the spawner out, remove the movement settings, and it's simply an overlay for the spawned versions behind it. If we hide it in the scene tree, you can see the version with the spawner component has that arrow symbol as a way to show that it has a live spawner component. Let's make sure we unhide it so it's visible in our game, but that's an early tip, trick, and hack for you. This will make it nice so that we can see where our spawning enemy is. Alright, so let's put a 5 in the random column for our spawner component and see how the enemy behaves. As you can see, it's choosing a random time between 0 and 5 seconds, and it chooses that number at the time it spawns the current one. So you could get a string of really quick spawns and then a string of some that might take the whole 5 seconds. It will be completely random. Also, there are settings here where we can set the object to only spawn when we are shooting or jumping, but we will just leave it at permanent, meaning nothing affects its ability to spawn except for it being awake. Speaking of, let's combine the two components. Let's get our wake settings back to 300 pixels to wake, and this time 300 pixels to sleep. And let's see what we get here. I think we made this enemy quite lively, and we didn't even write a single line of code to do it. Watch this video as many times as you need to, following along in BuildBox, because although it might have been a lot of information to give you, it really is simple once you've gotten your hands on it and worked with those numbers. It's really easy to bring your objects to life in BuildBox. In the next video, we are going to get into the world settings and character settings, and we are going to actually build more levels for Glitch. Remember, if you need help with anything you see in this series, you can find more helpful videos at buildbox.com/tutorials. There is a link on the welcome screen to take you there whenever you start BuildBox. So come on back for the next video, and I will see you in part 3.